So I've recently been chilling with sub-stories that I never made time to complete, and I'm currently playing Yakuza 4 with Tanimura. Spending time with this character eventually made me realize this guy isn't exactly a very popular character, is he? I mean, compared to Kiryu, Majima, Saejima, Akiyama, this dude is perhaps among the least talked about protagonists in the series, which I guess given how he only showed up in one game, he doesn't exactly have a ton of room to stay on people's radar. The same thing kind of happened with Shinada, and who knows, maybe one day in the future I'll talk about him too, but today I'm gonna focus on Mr. Cop here. Now, Tanimura was the character I remembered the least about in terms of combat, and looking back, I'm not surprised that I felt that way. Just purely based on first impressions, I remember Akiyama being this dude that primarily fought with his legs in such a stylish way that made me instantly fall in love with his combat. I remember Saejima being this brawler type Chad that could charge up and attack in the middle of a combo, which was really cool. But when I got to Tanimura, I just saw this slower and less fancy style of play, and even had a lower health bar. He generally felt the most technically inferior and overall not as fun to spectate. But as of recently, I've spent enough time with him that I eventually grew to appreciate the intricacies of his style of play. You see, the main reason why Tanimura on the surface doesn't seem as exhilarating to play and have some of his stats comparatively nerfed is because he's a defense type character. He's a specialist in a technique called pairing, in which instead of blocking, he finesses the opponent's attack by redirecting their entire body, giving yourself an opening. Sparring with Nair will help you appreciate how useful this tool can be because she's a very aggressive character that can easily stun you. I think this is the type of thing that feels especially fitting for him because of the fact that he's a cop, and compared to Blood Bowl Yakuza Man, him standing out as a specialist in countering makes sense. Of course, this technique does have its fair share of limitations. For one, you can't use it while you're being punched, so if you click L1 in the middle of that, he will just guard normally. So you're still susceptible to being attacked if, for instance, you're being swarmed by enemies and while you're in the middle of comboing someone, parrying won't help you in countering someone else's upcoming attack. I think this is especially bad because Tanimura is among the hardest characters to sidestep in the middle of a combo because of how slow he is. Akiyama and especially Kiryu can do this just fine. Saejima is also pretty slow at this, but since the dude barely flinches and his charge up attacks can give him invisibility frames, this isn't really much of an issue. Not to mention parrying has an effect period, so you can't exactly hold L1 infinitely. This can be tricky because opponents sometimes stall and you run the risk of getting opened up after the effect is over. But even with all of this, after a while I start to value this technique more, especially after I unlock the feature that increases the heat gauge after successfully pairing. And the thing about Tanimura is that his biggest strength is in his heat actions. He has some pretty interesting ones, probably my favorite one being the one where he handcuffs the opponents, and even if their health isn't at their limit, they'll still lose. Then there's also the fact that the more you fight with him, eventually you'll unlock combo finishing heat actions, something that I don't think any other character in this game has. It can at times even make finishing off opponents more efficient. For instance, imagine you have an opponent who's in low enough health that with one heat action he could potentially die. You don't have any weapons and you're not in a position where you can just grab him and do a heat action. Well, instead, you could just kick him 1 or 2 times with square, then triangle twice, activating the heat action. Even more beneficial when your heat gauge is just close enough to hit the required bar and just a few punches would be enough to get there. You can also activate a heat action after parrying, which then converts to a grab after damaging the opponent. His grab is pretty unique because of how it's animated, resembling a common police tactic to subdue people. After a while, I was having plenty of fun snapping people's necks, and now I'm even tempted to restart the campaign with a harder difficulty and see how much better he becomes against boss encounters now that I've upgraded this deed. I still generally prefer Akiyama and Kiryu's style of play, but I can say now that I think I have more fun playing him than I do with Saejima. Besides the way he plays, I also want to talk about him as a person. Tanimura in Yakuza 4 is a relatively unique protagonist compared to the other three for what I would consider to be 2 main reasons. For one, he's the only one who either isn't a Yakuza or has almost no social connection with them. Even Akiyama, who's technically a loan shark, his day-to-day life does involve interacting with Yakuza figures to the point where he's even acquainted with a few. With Tanimura, on the other hand, it was only after he kept digging deeper into the Yasuko case that he started to get involved with the Yakuza. Having this difference in their social surroundings, I feel allows us to look at the city from a different side, and this is very well illustrated through his main base, that being Little Asia, a setting first introduced in this game, and shows us a more underground area of Kamurocho. Beneath the flashy and urban streets of Tokyo, we see a much less enriched location that's tight, hidden from the city, and home to immigrants living in the city. For a game that chose to take place in a single location instead of the last two entries, the way they went about compensating it was in my opinion well agreeable, as it allows for Kamurocho to be expanded not so much in size, but more so in terms of its scale, showing us what goes on other corners of the city. It was also through the submissions that I came to appreciate just what exactly goes on in the everyday life of Tanimura, how much he gets involved with people from other Asian descendants, including a detective from the Philippines. Now, unlike in Judgment, Yakuza 4 is not a detective-focused game with mechanics specialized to appease to that, but it does still give us opportunities to explore some cases. The GG investigation was an example of an ongoing sub-story that was made up of several missions, and as we sparred with Nair, the conversations involving the case progressed, and the way we kept getting informed about the case, while certainly not main story levels of enthralling, it was still intriguing, especially when the deeper we got, the more we kept getting targeted. This also happened when we were investigating the case involving human trafficking of sex workers, and what makes it even cool is the focus on foreign affairs. Aside from being a police officer, involving himself with immigrants represents a large portion of his routine. In fact, his life as a community safety officer only represents a portion of what he's all about. By the end of the investigation of the Bridge Syndicate case, we got to learn who was Tanimura's birth dad. Yusuke Kaga was a former partner of Tanimura's first adoptive father, Taigi Tanimura. Both of them were police officers, and Kaga was revealed to be involved in a smuggle operation involving foreign sex workers, paid off by a shady politician, only to later start a relationship with one of the women there, which led to the birth of Tanimura. It was surprising seeing what most would argue to be a pretty big aspect of his backstory being explored in a side mission, and not the main campaign, although to be fair, it's barely important to the main story, so I don't really mind all that much. One of the things Kaga wished for was for his son to be a better and less corrupt person than him. In fact, the reason why he chose the name Masayoshi was because Masayoshi means justice or righteous, something that Tanimura came to be portrayed as the further the main campaign went by. He eventually came to the realization that he was surrounded by people with skeletons in their closet. People he considered his superiors turned out to be involved in conspiracies, and even the death of his first foster father, Taigi. He was left as the only person in his department to be considered as righteous, which not only mirrored the life of his father, but also felt intimidating to people like Sugiuchi, a man who started off as a simple member of the Ueno Seiwa clan, infiltrating as a police officer in order to carry out the grand conspiracy alongside Katsuragi. But as he spent more time being a cop, he came to appreciate the job and enjoy being thanked and patted on the back for his duties, while at the same time being torn inside because of the amount of guilt ripping him apart. This basically represents the contrast between Sugiuchi and Katsuragi, both members of the Ueno Seiwa clan, working on the same conspiracy and hoping to reach the same goals, except Katsuragi is a much more cold-blooded person. He desires power, therefore reaching this goal is enough for him to cleanse any amount of guilt for the misfortune he causes to anyone around him. Meanwhile, Sugiuchi is more easily reminded of his sins, especially because of the professional field he pursues, in which he is confronted with bright-eyed people like Taigi and his son Masayoshi, making him almost wish he lived an honest life from the very beginning. I can't imagine what it must have felt like to work alongside the son of the person he murdered decades ago after his secret was exposed. In fact, Tanimura eventually finding out about his cover feels like he's being haunted by his past, which in a way is something he was deep down hoping would eventually happen. What makes this more interesting is the fact that at the end of the day, Tanimura is not exactly a squeaky clean cop. In fact, there are things he does that are arguably illegal, or at the very least are not disciplinary traits for a cop to have. Stuff like gambling, bribing, blackmailing, and supporting an off-the-books community of hosting immigrant children, likely without any legally registered identities. Tanimura does not fully conform to police protocol, if him doing so comes at the cost of him not helping someone in need. It's why he will go out of his way to participate in these outlaw underground practices if it means benefiting the people he wants to help. The reason why he gambles is because he wants to accumulate enough money to support the shelters, even if it means playing a game of Russian roulette. The reason why he commits blackmails is for the sake of keeping exploitative people in check. In the case of immigrant children, given how he was taken in by Zhao, a half-Chinese restaurant owner that served to be his foster father after he lost his dad, two dads if you count his biological one, I can imagine how he must have felt some emotional attachment to these children who were in a very similar situation when he was much younger, and how thankful he is to Zhao for raising him all these years, making him develop a sense of duty to repay the other children for suffering the same circumstances, also helped by the fact that he's half Thai. It's the willingness to fight for what he believes that allows him to confront his superior officers when they're involved in shady businesses. When he met Sugiyuchi after he had shot Mishima, Sugiyuchi was cornered by several cops pointing guns at him. At that point, he was caught red-handed, and normally they would have every reason to arrest him. But in reality, the moment he rejected their offense and dared to shoot at him, they couldn't do anything to him. He was untouchable thanks to the system protecting him. But because Tanimura doesn't feel the need to abide to the system, he's willing to fire a gun at him. He even confirms himself that it's because he doesn't follow the rules that he can do this. Munakata was the deputy commissioner of the Metropolitan Police Department and one of the main heads behind everything that was happening. He was a powerful man because he could easily command people and abuse his power to benefit himself. It's how he gained from overlooking the secret of the massacre of '85, which is why it's very ironic when the person taking him down is someone from the inside, someone who doesn't fear defying the higher-ups in the police department. I would say this type of idealism that's the second main thing that makes him unique from the other protagonists in Yakuza 4. While they're all inspiring in their own way, at the beginning of the story, Akiyama was a wealthy individual who was yet to trust himself in his judgments of people whom he deemed worthy of his help. Saejima is a murderer who still needed to make up for his sins and was overwhelmed by the nightmares of his crime. Kiryu had moved on from Kamurocho and was striving to work on the orphanage he's managing back in Okinawa. Tanimura, on the other hand, I would consider to be someone who represents a bright future for Kamurocho. This is a city that's embedded with crime and corruption occurring on a daily basis, including on the police side of things. In fact, throughout the series, with the exception of a few cops, the police have generally been proven to be untrustworthy and unreliable. Tanimura has yet to prove to be a fallen cop, and it's through him acting under his own conviction that allows us to see how altruistic he is, even when he's not following police protocol. Yakuza 4 is largely a story about a long and carefully planned system crumbling. The world, the climate, and the system as we saw it was a byproduct of a list of actions made by closely guarded agents operating under the shadows and feeding off of the misfortune and ignorance of others to construct a system that benefited them. And 2010 was the year when all of those people were finally getting reunited by their ghosts. Residues of the instruments they exploited to stay in the position they were at were slowly coming their way. For people like Sugiyuchi and Munakata, they were met with the best kind of ghost that the city of Kamurocho could receive. An honest and bright cop that stick to justice. Someone who reminded them that they're failures, not just as cops, but also as conspirators. Yuji Katsura was also met with the same fate. A man who got away with silencing people and taking advantage of sex workers, all while wearing the mask of the chairman of the Asian Women's Friendship Association. Until eventually, the birth son of the person he sent to kill finally came to hunt him and take him down for good. I can't imagine what it felt like for Saki, someone who saw two of the closest people to her die within 3 years, only to then see their child return and finally bring justice. Not even out of a sense of revenge. In fact, Tanimura even stated he doesn't really care that much about who his real father was. In the end, he's doing it for the victims that are being exploited by these corrupt elites. It showed Saki that her partner's efforts in fighting for justice were finally getting paid off, as their actions inspired Tanimura to carry out their legacy. It's a real shame that Tanimura never returned for future games, possibly due to the controversy surrounding the actor that played him to the point where they had to replace him for the remaster. Especially now in present day where the power structure in Kamurocho has changed so much and is still continuing to change. In Yakuza 6, Akiyama was shown to still be in touch with the homeless community and did his best to aid them during the hostile climate they were in at the time. Imagine how crucial Tanimura's role would have been in that story, especially because Little Asia played a big role in the plot of Yakuza 6. The fact that Tanimura wasn't involved in any way is a bit saddening. It would have been nice if he had a role in the city's continuing transformation, but I think at this point he's an abandoned character that probably won't see any return. Although I guess now that they hired a new actor, I do wonder if the likelihood of him appearing in the future has increased. Though then again, if not even Akiyama made an appearance in Yakuza 7, I doubt this decade-old character has any chance of ever returning. I think it's safe to say that his arc ended the moment the game rolled the credits, and I guess for now I can accept that. Anyway, I have a list of other characters I may or may not talk about in the future. The one I'm the most eager to do is Mine. He's pretty kino, and if I never get the opportunity to gush about him, I'll be very disappointed with myself. Anyways, see you all next time.